Roman ships were true giants of the ancient world. These enormous floating fortresses dominated the entire Mediterranean Sea. They carried entire legions, heavy artillery, and tons of supplies. It seemed that nothing could crush such incredible naval power. But as soon as these giants encountered a real storm, they were shattered to pieces. In a single battle against the elements, Rome could lose hundreds of ships. Their vessels sank along with thousands of the empire's finest soldiers. This seems utterly illogical for the most advanced engineering civilization of the time. Now look at 8th century Scandinavia. Their narrow and seemingly fragile boats look like toys compared to the Roman giants. But it was precisely these Scandinavian toys that crossed the most treacherous Atlantic. The Vikings ventured into the open ocean, where waves reached the height of a 5-story building. Their ships survived where Roman galleys were guaranteed to turn into mass graves. Why did a seemingly fragile boat triumph where an invincible fortress broke? The answer lies in a completely different understanding of the laws of physics. The Romans believed that a ship must resist the water. The Vikings, however, understood that one simply needs to come to an agreement with the water. And this is not just a beautiful philosophical metaphor from ancient sagas. It is a rigorous engineering calculation that modern designers still use today. You might be surprised, but the shipbuilders of the North were a full 1,000 years ahead of science. People usually think that strength always means rigidity and immobility. If you build a wall, it shouldn't waver in the wind. That's exactly how the ancient masters thought when creating their famous ships. They fastened the planks so tightly that the hull didn't move at all, and therein lay their most crucial and fatal mistake. Modern science has proven one thing that is not immediately obvious to the average person. Excessive rigidity in a dynamic environment always leads to disaster. If an airplane doesn't flap its wings in the air, they'll simply fall off. The same rule applies ruthlessly in the raging ocean, but this is where it gets really interesting, because the Vikings didn't know this. They had no wind tunnels or computer simulations of loads. They had only axes, wood, and the harsh northern sea. Nevertheless, they created a technology that seems absolutely impossible. Their drakars twisted on the waves like giant wooden snakes, and this sight must have terrified random passengers to death. Imagine standing on the deck as it literally breathes beneath your feet. The sides twist, wooden parts creak and rub against each other. It sounds as if the entire ship is about to fall apart right now. But it was precisely this frightening flexibility that saved the lives of thousands of sailors. While a Roman ship tried to plow through a wave, a Viking ship simply became one with it. Today, we'll take a detailed look at this fascinating historical mystery. We'll look below deck and study the anatomy of the Northern Fleet. You'll learn why iron nails can be worse than wooden pegs. We'll also understand why fierce warriors rubbed animal fat on their sails. Spoiler, it had nothing to do with their religious rituals. This story will completely turn your understanding of ancient technologies upside down. You'll see that sometimes barbarians from the forests turn out to be smarter than enlightened academics. Get ready, because we're heading into very rough waters. Hold on tight to the railings, because our drakar is already setting sail. Let's begin our dive into the secrets of the true masters of the seas. The Roman Empire built its states just as it built its famous roads. Everything had to be monumental, heavy, and absolutely immovable. Their engineers were geniuses at constructing stone aqueducts and massive colosseums that still stand today. Therefore, they logically applied this same concept to the construction of their navy. A Roman warship was a veritable floating fortress made of the thickest and strongest wood. Their ships were built using the so-called clinker-built method, which required precision akin to that of a jeweler. The planks were joined edge to edge and tightly secured by a complex system of tenons and mortises. From the inside, The structure was reinforced with massive stiffening ribs, transforming the ship into a single monolith. The result was an incredibly rigid hull without a single visible gap. For the Mediterranean Sea, this was simply an ideal and ingenious solution for centuries. In these relatively calm and predictable waters, such a ship felt right at home. But everything changed dramatically when these leviathans ventured beyond the confines of their cozy and tranquil basin. During the First Punic War, Rome decided to demonstrate its might and sent its massive fleet into a storm. The result was catastrophic. In a single night, they lost more than 200 ships and 100,000 men. This is not a typo nor an exaggeration by ancient historians seeking to add drama. A massive, well-trained army simply vanished into the black waves in a matter of hours due to an engineering error. Why did these super strong and massive structures fall apart so easily? The answer lies in the basic physics of the interaction between a solid body and a powerful flow of water. When a massive storm surge hits an absolutely rigid and immovable hull, the impact energy has nowhere to go. The hull must either completely absorb this colossal blow or inevitably crack at the seams. And in this confrontation, water always proves to be far stronger than any Roman timber, no matter how thick. Imagine hitting a concrete pillar with all your might using a heavy baseball bat. The bat won't bend to absorb the impact. It will simply snap in half right in your hands. The proud Roman galleys behaved exactly the same way in the conditions of the raging open sea. The waves lifted the rigid hull at the bow and stern simultaneously, leaving the center unsupported. The middle of the ship literally hung in the air, and under its own enormous weight, the keel simply snapped. Modern architects are well aware of this deadly trap of excessive rigidity. That is precisely why skyscrapers in earthquake-prone areas are always designed so that they can sway slightly. If a high-rise building is made absolutely rigid, any strong earthquake will destroy it down to its very foundations. The Romans did not understand this principle and continued to fanatically reinforce their ships with additional thick beams. They tried to conquer the wild elements with brute force alone, which in the end was a doomed idea from the start. Each new layer of wood only weighed down the already unwieldy and slow vessel. The ship became even more inert and resisted the pressure of the water with even greater destructive force. As a result, the destructive energy from the wave's impact only multiplied with every collision. This sounds like utter engineering madness to any modern engineer or builder. But for the ancient mindset, acknowledging the weakness or flexibility of a material was simply unthinkable and shameful. Now let's transport ourselves to the cold, harsh, and extremely inhospitable north. 8th century Scandinavia did not possess the boundless resources and gold of the great Roman Empire. The locals did not have thousands of enslaved laborers to build gilded floating palaces. They had only dense forests, an icy ocean, and a burning desire to survive in these conditions. It was this total scarcity of resources that forced them to invent a completely different, revolutionary approach to shipbuilding. The northern craftsmen didn't even try to openly challenge the crushing and uncontrollable force of the ocean. They closely observed nature's behavior and tried to learn from it at every opportunity. Have you ever seen with your own eyes how an ordinary fish swims in a very fast river current? It doesn't try to stay motionless in one spot, like a heavy concrete block or a stone. The fish bends its entire body along with the current, masterfully using its energy for its own movement. It was precisely this natural, almost animal-like flexibility that the Vikings were determined to embody in wood at all costs. They completely abandoned the idea of a monolithic, heavy hull, choosing a completely different technological path. Their decision seemed primitive to their contemporaries, but in reality, It concealed incredible engineering genius. They created unique ships that could literally breathe and move in unison with the elements. But how exactly did they manage to make rigid oak wood so flexible and alive? The secret of the great Vikings began long before the first planed board touched the cold water. The Romans mercilessly sawed logs across the grain to quickly obtain the smoothest and flattest boards possible. This produced beautiful exterior material, but completely destroyed the natural internal strength of the living wood. Scandinavian craftsmen considered such a barbaric approach a true crime against nature and logic. As a matter of principle, they never used saws to create the most important load-bearing elements of the hull. Instead, they took heavy axes and split oak trunks by hand along their natural grain. It sounds like an excessively labor-intensive, time-consuming, and even somewhat primitive task, doesn't it? However, it was precisely this painstaking method that allowed the tree's invisible cellular structure to remain completely intact. The planks obtained in this way were several times thinner than Roman ones, yet turned out to be much stronger. And most importantly, they possessed incredible natural flexibility, which is impossible to achieve through sawing. From these thin and living planks, the shipbuilders began to assemble the hull in their own special, unique way. They used what is known as clinker planking, often referred to as overlapping planking. Each new plank overlapped the edge of the previous one slightly, resembling the scales of a legendary dragon. The Romans would surely have considered such a design extremely ugly, crude, and aerodynamically flawed. But it was precisely this stepped structure that gave the drakers their almost magical seafaring properties. The clinker planking created long, longitudinal ridges along the ship's sides that acted as stiffeners. They worked exactly like the corrugated layer of cardboard in modern shipping boxes. The thin, lightweight material suddenly gained a fantastic ability to withstand enormous longitudinal loads. At the same time, the structure's crucial lateral flexibility remained intact, staying at the same level. The ship could literally twist and turn on the crests of the waves without the risk of suddenly snapping in half. But the Norse people's greatest engineering masterpiece was hidden at the very bottom, in the ship's keel. It was a keel that differed strikingly and fundamentally from all known ancient counterparts. For southern peoples, the keel was a beam that was as heavy, thick, and absolutely rigid as possible. The Vikings, however, carved their keel with great difficulty from a single solid piece of flexible oak. The result was a truly flexible spine, capable of springing under the immense pressure of the water. When a drakkar encountered a real storm, this wooden spine began to work actively. A huge wave lifted the ship's bow high into the dark, cloud-covered sky. Instead of cracking under the load, the keel bent gently, obediently taking the shape of the passing wave. The impact energy did not destroy the material but was evenly and rapidly distributed along the entire length of the vessel. Modern engineers call this rare property dynamic absorption of the applied load. In the modern automotive industry, this same principle is used today in so-called crumple zones. In a serious accident, the front of the car is designed to crumple in order to absorb the impact and save the people inside. The Vikings successfully incorporated this life-saving elasticity into the design of their warships. Their drakkars could bend and stretch slightly, effectively absorbing the fury of the raging Northern Ocean. And thanks to this flexibility, the crew always remained relatively safe even in a storm. Of course, during a severe storm, salt water inevitably and constantly seeped into the open ship. The hull bent severely under the blows, the gaps between the planks widened temporarily, and spray flew in all directions. But the Scandinavians had anticipated this and didn't even try to make their ship completely watertight. They always had special scoops on hand to constantly and quickly bail out the excess water. It was a very small price to pay for the fact that their ship didn't break apart or sink instantly. Imagine the real sensations of a Roman legionnaire on such a constantly bending and breathing deck. He would surely have gone mad with terror instantly, hearing the wild creaking and groaning of living wood beneath his feet. For an experienced Viking, however, this characteristic sound was far sweeter than any Scandinavian harp. If his ship creaked loudly and bent, it meant it was alive, functioning, and successfully battling the sea. Dead silence during a storm would have been a sure sign to him that the rigid structure was about to snap. But flexible planks and a springy keel are actually only half of their great secret. If these moving parts were fastened with ordinary rigid nails, all the magic of the design would vanish instantly. The Northern engineers had to devise a unique and reliable system for joining parts. They needed something special, capable of holding the ship firmly together while allowing it to move freely. And their solution, involving complex metalwork, proved no less ingenious for its time. Roman builders loved massive iron nails and heavy, rigid spikes. They hammered them into the wood until they were tight as a drum, as if they were building a monolithic brick wall to defend their borders. This worked perfectly and reliably on land, when you were building a sturdy house, a barn, or an ordinary cart. But water shows no mercy to those who try to impose their rigid and unchanging rules on it. With constant rocking and vibrations on the open sea, Roman nails simply tore the pliable wood apart from the inside. Scandinavian craftsmen fully understood this destructive mechanism and the resulting structural damage to the wood. Therefore, they developed a fundamentally different fastening system for their flexible hulls. Instead of ordinary nails, they used forged iron rivets with small, washer-like discs. This ingenious element allowed the planks to shift slightly relative to one another under the force of strong waves. The ship's hull was not rigidly glued into a single block. It retained its precious and life-saving flexibility. But here it gets even more interesting, because the expensive metal was by no means used everywhere. In the most critical and heavily loaded areas, the Vikings used the roots of young spruce and pine trees. These roots were boiled for a long time in special vats, turning them into incredibly strong and elastic ropes. They literally sewed the massive internal frames to the outer hull plating of the ship with them. It sounds as if they were assembling a huge warship using ordinary shoelaces. However, modern tests and trials have fully confirmed the genius of this ancient solution. Spruce root possesses a remarkable and almost limitless reserve of elasticity under severe tension. When a massive wave struck the hull, these natural ropes stretched like powerful rubber cords. They gently absorbed the shock of the impact and then returned the plank to its original position. A metal nail in such an extreme situation would simply have been torn out of its socket along with a piece of wood. This shipbuilding technique seems primitive, strange, and unreliable to us today, but it was precisely this method that allowed the legendary Drakkars to survive the most terrifying storm conditions of the Atlantic. The entire ship was a single living organism with its own flexible joints and strong ligaments. Iron rivets served as its sturdy bones, while spruce roots acted as elastic tendons. Compared to them, a Roman galley looked like a clumsy and fragile invalid in heavy armor. Modern aerospace engineering has reached exactly the same conclusions quite recently. The wings of modern giant passenger airliners are not welded rigidly to the fuselage, as many people think. They are attached via a complex system of flexible hinges and special dampers to absorb vibrations. If an airplane wing were completely rigid, it would simply fall off at the first sign of serious turbulence. The Vikings successfully applied this principle of aviation safety centuries before the first airplanes appeared. You might think for a second that such a flexible ship must constantly and severely leak, and you'd be absolutely right. Water did indeed seep in little by little through the movable joints, but the northern shipbuilders solved this unpleasant problem in a very original and effective way. They caulked the gaps between the planks with animal wool that had been pre-soaked in thick resin. This elastic padding constantly compressed and expanded along with the ship's overall breathing. The resin prevented the wool from rotting due to constant moisture, and water could not penetrate this fatty barrier. And even if a small leak appeared somewhere, it was never considered a disaster for the crew. There were always relief bailers on duty on board, whose monotonous work never stopped for a single minute. It was a harsh maritime routine, but it was precisely this routine that ensured the crew's survival in the open and unpredictable ocean. The Romans would certainly have deemed such a flexible structure defective right on the shipyard's slipways. The irony is that it was precisely these defective and flexible barbarian ships that ultimately discovered America. Meanwhile, Rome's perfect, ultra-strong and massive galleys remained prisoners of their own inland Mediterranean Sea. Flexibility and the ability to adapt to the elements proved far more effective and resilient than brute physical strength. But a flexible hull is only a foundation. Any ship still needs a powerful and reliable engine. And in the complex matter of sails, the Vikings were again centuries ahead of their time. Ancient seafarers took great pride in their huge and beautiful canvas sails, but in the harsh northern latitudes, these heavy, water-absorbing fabrics instantly turned into a deadly trap. The Scandinavians had to invent a completely new and unusual material to conquer the raging winds. They turned to their sheep, walruses, and some very strange household chemicals for help. Get ready to find out why a truly good and reliable sail should smell like rotten fish.
Steady as she goes.
The Roman approach to sailmaking was as straightforward, clear, and logical as possible for their culture. They wove huge, smooth sheets of linen that caught the favorable southerly wind perfectly. In the warm, dry climate of the Mediterranean, such sails worked flawlessly, reliably, and lasted for years. But in the harsh Atlantic, the linen quickly became waterlogged, became impossible to hoist, and began to drag the entire ship to the bottom. Furthermore, in severe cold, a wet linen sail instantly turned into a heavy crust of ice. The Vikings simply could not afford such a luxury. Sailing with frozen and brittle sheets instead of sails, they needed a special material that would keep the ship warm and remain soft, just as clothing keeps a person warm. So Scandinavian women spent months weaving sails from pure sheep's wool of special northern breeds. It was an incredibly long, tedious, and painstaking task that required immense patience from many craftswomen. Creating a single large sail took far longer than building the wooden hull of the ship itself. But wool itself also absorbs moisture very well and gets wet quickly in the rain or spray. To finally solve this problem, harsh and pungent Scandinavian alchemy was put to use. The fabric was generously and repeatedly soaked in a mixture of horse fat, tree resin, and the fat of hunted marine animals. The smell of such a sail was simply unbearable and nauseating to any modern person, but this pungent and sticky mixture created a perfect water-repellent coating on every single thread. Icy water simply rolled off the grease-soaked wool, leaving the sail light, dry, and elastic. In essence, the Vikings invented an ancient and highly effective counterpart to the modern membrane material known as Gore-Tex. Their sails never froze or broke, even in the most severe Arctic frosts and storms. Moreover, natural wool possesses a unique natural ability to stretch slightly under strong gusts of wind. This created an ideal aerodynamic dome shape, which was completely unattainable with stiff linen fabrics. The Roman mast was a heavy, thick wooden pole firmly secured to the hull itself. When powerful storm winds battered such a rigid sail, the mast began to act like a giant lever. With terrifying force, it tried to tear the ship's hull apart, often simply sending it to the bottom along with everyone on board. The Vikings, however, had a completely different mast design, surprisingly light and incredibly mobile. Their mast was mounted in a special massive wooden block that the sailors called a fish. This block not only allowed the mast to be securely fixed in place while underway, but also enabled it to be lowered very quickly. In the event of a sudden storm, the crew could carefully lower the mast onto the deck in a matter of minutes. This instantly reduced the sail area and saved the ship from certain capsizing or keel damage. Roman sailors could only helplessly pray to their gods and await their fate in a similar situation. They simply lacked the physical means to quickly and safely dismantle their heavy masts. For the Vikings, lowering the mast was never considered a sign of cowardice, weakness, or surrendering to the elements. It was a sound tactical maneuver that allowed them to calmly weather the most violent onslaught of the ocean. Once stripped of its sail and mast, the Drakkar turned into a giant, highly stable, unsinkable float. It drifted freely on the waves, offering virtually no resistance to the wind or water. As soon as the weather improved slightly, the mast was just as swiftly and smoothly put back in place. The woolen fabric of the sail itself also had a built-in safety mechanism for extreme loads. During a critically strong gust of wind, the woolen threads began to stretch gradually and evenly. The sail itself released some of the excess wind pressure, preventing the light vessel from capsizing. If the pressure exceeded all conceivable limits, the fabric would simply tear in predetermined and safe locations. Mending a small hole in the wool in the middle of the sea is much easier than building a new fleet from scratch. Imagine this whole scene through the eyes of an educated ancient engineer or a proud Roman captain. Some barbarians are sailing on a bending, creaking piece of wood, covered by a smelly woolen blanket instead of a sail. And yet, they manage to cross entire oceans that drive even the bravest and most experienced southern sailors mad. This completely shattered all the stereotypes of the time about what a proper and powerful ship should look like. But the greatest insult to Roman pride always lay far below the waterline. We are talking about the extremely shallow draft of the Scandinavian ship and its amazing ability to literally glide across the water's surface. The Romans built enormous deep draft monsters that plowed through the sea deeply and heavily, as if with a massive plow. The Vikings, on the other hand, created ships that, thanks to their shape, literally flew over the surface, barely touching it. Their ships could easily enter virtually any shallow pool along the coast or a river. And it was precisely this unique feature of the hull that became the key to their future global expansion across the world. The classic Roman ship had a very deep draft, which was due to its design. Its heavy underwater section plunged several meters into the dark, dense waters. This provided excellent stability when carrying heavy ballistae, enormous supplies of provisions, and thousands of legionnaires. But the deep draft meant that the ship was forced to constantly and laboriously cut through the water ahead of it. The ship expended a colossal amount of energy, and the rowers' strength simply to move forward slowly. Scandinavian drakkars had an extremely shallow draft for their imposing size. A massive 20-meter warship could sit in the water by only 1 meter or even less. This sounds like a true physical anomaly that should immediately capsize at the slightest gust of wind. But thanks to its wide, flat bottom and perfect balance, the vessel maintained phenomenal stability. The drakkar did not cut through the water with a heavy bow. It literally glided over it, like a modern professional surfer. It was precisely this shallow draft that saved hundreds of lives in the most brutal Atlantic storms. when a giant killer wave crashed into the ship. A Roman vessel took the blow with its entire rigid hull. The enormous mass of water simply crushed the stone-like immobility of the structure with its incredible weight. The Viking ship behaved completely differently and much more intelligently in this deadly situation. Like a light cork, it instantly floated to the very crest of the giant wave, offering no resistance. The physics of this process are extremely simple, yet incredibly effective in rough seas. The smaller your underwater surface area, the less resistance you offer to the aggressive aquatic environment. The wave simply slid under the flat bottom of the drakkar, causing no fatal damage to the structure. Modern Coast Guard rescue boats are designed according to exactly the same engineering principle. They must quickly ride the waves, rather than trying to plow through them with their mass. Moreover, the shallow draft gave the Vikings an unprecedented tactical advantage over any opponent. Their ships could freely enter the narrowest rivers and come right up to sandy beaches. For a surprise attack, they had absolutely no need for deep water ports or specially equipped docks. A squad of fierce warriors could land right on the green lawn in front of your house while you slept. It was precisely this mobility that made their raids so sudden, terrifying, and unpredictable for all of Europe. The absolute symmetry of the bow and stern is another ingenious and practical touch from the Scandinavian craftsmen. A Roman ship required a lot of time and open space to turn around. A drakkar, however, could instantly change direction without turning the hull in a narrow space. The rowers simply had to sit facing the opposite direction and begin rowing in unison. In the narrow, winding fjords or during river ambushes, this design saved thousands of Norse lives. Even the steering systems of these types of vessels differed radically in their essence. Southerners used two massive and heavy steering oars on both sides of their ship. The Vikings, however, made do with a single sleek and highly responsive rudder oar on the starboard side. It was attached to the hull using the same flexible and durable fur root. If it accidentally struck an underwater rock, the oar would simply spring gently to the side, remaining completely intact. The combination of all these factors created a truly perfect machine for human survival at sea. A flexible hull, elastic seams, a breathable woolen sail, and a smooth, flat bottom. It was not just a wooden boat, but a true technological triumph over the harsh and capricious forces of nature. The Vikings never sought to dominate the ocean as the proud and self-assured Romans did. They became a natural part of this great ocean, learning to speak its complex language. That is precisely why their light wooden vessels eventually reached the shores of distant North America. Meanwhile, Rome's invincible and massive galleys rotted for centuries at the bottom of the tranquil Mediterranean Sea. We are accustomed to viewing antiquity as the undisputed pinnacle of engineering thought across the entire ancient world. But sometimes the most brilliant and practical solutions are born not in quiet marble academies at all. They emerge where the slightest design flaw means immediate and agonizing death in icy water. The entire history of the Roman and Scandinavian fleets teaches us one stunning and important life lesson. Enormous size and excessive rigidity are far from always a guarantee of victory in the long run. The ability to adapt in time and bend correctly under the blows of fate, that is the true superpower. This principle works perfectly well both in professional shipbuilding and in our everyday modern lives. And now you know exactly why the ancient Vikings always laughed in the face of the most terrifying storms. A Roman sailor always felt like nothing more than a hostage inside his huge, heavy ship. His life depended entirely on the work of hundreds of slave rowers and long, convoluted chains of command. In a fierce storm, he could only pray fearfully to the gods and hope for the strength of the dead oak planks. The Scandinavians, however, had a completely different, deeper psychology of interaction with their vessel. Every man aboard a drakkar knew his ship as well as his own body. Any free Norse man actively participated in the construction of his own boat from a very young age. With his own hands, he carved the flexible planks and carefully caulked the seams with oiled sheep's wool. Therefore, on the open sea, he did not panic upon hearing the deafening crack of the mast bending in the wind. He knew exactly the true breaking point of every rivet and every seam in its familiar place. This gave the entire crew phenomenal psychological resilience in moments of the most terrifying mortal danger. Think of modern motorsports and professional racers flying down the track at tremendous speeds. A driver trusts his complex machine only when he thoroughly understands all of its inner workings. The Romans, on the other hand, were merely passive passengers on massive state-owned floating barges. The Vikings, on the other hand, were the true racers of the ancient and medieval world in their racing machines. Their connection to technology was practically mystical, inseparable, and deeply personal to each warrior. This profound difference in mentality was vividly reflected even in the very names of their warships. Southerners gave their ships grandiose and fearsome names of great gods or dangerous predatory animals. The Northerners, on the other hand, named their boats very poetically, emphasizing their smooth movement and incredible lightness. Gliding over the waves or treading the sea, for them, these were the names of living, sentient beings. They always treated their drakkar not as a soulless tool, but as a faithful companion. For the vast Roman Empire, the loss of an entire fleet was simply another financial disaster and a drain on resources. The Senate imposed new taxes, and thousands of enslaved laborers quickly built another 100 ships exactly like them. For a small Viking clan, the loss of a single longship meant the death of all the community's finest and bravest men. That is why they never took any unnecessary or foolish engineering risks during construction. Every technical decision they made was dictated by the harsh and extremely high cost of human life. It is also interesting to note how exactly they successfully solved the most complex problem of navigation without heavy instruments. Ancient sailors always tried not to lose sight of the familiar coastline of their Mediterranean. The Scandinavians, however, boldly ventured thousands of miles out into the open ocean, where there are absolutely no visible landmarks. They knew how to read the sea by the color of the water, the behavior of migratory birds, and even the direction of small waves. Their primary navigational tool was their own survival expertise, accumulated over many generations. Instead of the magnetic compass we are familiar with, they used so-called magical sunstones. These are special natural crystals that polarize light in a unique way and accurately indicate the sun's position. They worked flawlessly, even through the dense veil of northern fog or very thick storm clouds. It sounds like real magic from a modern fantasy film, but it was pure, proven physics. Modern scientists have now fully confirmed the effectiveness of this amazing ancient Viking gadget. All of this combined created the image of invincible and ferocious sea demons in the frightened eyes of Europeans. When their recognizable striped sail appeared on the horizon, panic instantly swept through all the coastal towns. Ordinary people simply couldn't understand how these light vessels could sail in such terrible and foul weather. They genuinely believed that dark and evil otherworldly forces were aiding these savage barbarians in everything. But their true magic was nothing more than brilliant engineering, calculation, and personal fearlessness. Imagine the indescribable terror of an ordinary medieval guard on a high fortress wall by the river. He knows for certain that the sea is raging and no normal ship would leave the harbor. And suddenly, out of the thick fog, a drakkar rolls silently and swiftly onto the sandy shore. It doesn't drop a heavy anchor or seek a deep harbor for a long mooring at the pier. The ship simply drives onto the sand, and armed, battle-ready warriors immediately leap out of it. It was precisely this devastating element of surprise that allowed them to terrorize the entire territory of Europe for centuries. They successfully besieged Paris, burned down wealthy English monasteries, and easily reached the scorching heat of Africa. Their ships were the sole key to immense wealth, glory, and historical immortality. By that time, the Roman Empire had long since lain in dusty ruins and been forgotten, and the light wooden boats of the north were just beginning their great and victorious march.
Steady as she goes.
Today you live in a world of reinforced concrete, composite materials, and supercomputers. It seems to us that ancient people were naive simpletons with axes. We look down on their technology through the lens of our own progress. But the history of Scandinavian shipbuilding shatters this arrogant illusion to smithereens. They intuitively grasp the laws of physics that we have only recently discovered. Their construction methods seem illogical only at first glance. Yes, wooden pegs and fir roots instead of iron nails sound like a joke. Yes, grease-soaked wool as a sail seems like a strange solution. But all of this worked in conditions where metal and flax mercilessly killed people. The Vikings created the perfect tool for their specific deadly environment. The Romans failed in storms not because of stupidity or a lack of resources. They were undone by their own success and their belief in the infallibility of their systems. They were accustomed to solving problems by adding weight, thickness, and rigidity. But the ocean does not bow to emperors and does not respect the thickness of wooden armor. You cannot fight nature with its own weapons. You must learn to work around it. Modern engineers around the world have fully embraced this wisdom. Our bridges sway in the wind so they don't collapse into the river. Our cars crumple on impact to absorb the destructive kinetic energy. We have finally understood what the Scandinavians knew as far back as the 8th century. Strength lies not in resistance, but in the proper distribution of loads. Every time you fly in a modern passenger plane, remember this story. Look at the wing, which bends menacingly in the turbulence. Don't be frightened by this sight, because it is precisely this flexibility that saves your life. You fly through the air thanks to the same principles that propelled the ancient Drakers. Technology has changed beyond recognition, but the basic physics remain the same. The history of the Vikings is not just a fairy tale about bearded warriors in helmets. It is a hymn to human ingenuity in the most extreme conditions on the planet. It is proof that careful observation of nature is more important than brute force. Their ships were living beings, created for symbiosis with the raging sea. And in this symbiosis lies their true, still unmatched greatness. The next time you hear about the superiority of ancient engineering, smile. Remember those 200 Roman ships that surrendered at the first storm. And remember the narrow wooden boats that crossed the icy Atlantic. Victory does not belong to those who build the thickest and most immovable walls. Victory belongs to those who know how to dance to the music of the destructive elements. One can only admire the courage of the people who dared to challenge such an ocean, without compasses, without satellite communication, and without powerful diesel engines. Just a handful of rugged people on a bending piece of wood against the endless water. It sounds like pure madness, but that is exactly how great history was made. And now we understand what brilliant science lay behind this madness. This brings our historical investigation to its logical conclusion. I hope this episode has made you look at familiar historical facts in a new light. We'll continue to unearth the most amazing secrets of forgotten technologies from the past. History is still full of mysteries that science has only recently been able to explain, and we'll definitely explore them in the next episodes of our documentary series. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this storytelling format. Write in the comments which technology of the Northern Masters surprised you the most. Your engagement helps us create more in-depth historical explorations like this. See you in the next episodes where the past will once again meet modern science. And remember, the most ingenious solutions are always right in plain sight.